All right, we have reached the top of the hour, so we're going to go on and get started. First, I'd like to thank everyone for joining us today. We're really excited to start back up our PCI Readiness series. This session will be covering Requirement 7. We've got a lot of great PCI-related content that we are planning to release over the next few months, so be on the lookout for that. Before we get started, I just want to encourage everyone to submit questions using the Q&A feature throughout the presentation, and we will have time to address those at the end. Just to give you a little bit of background about who we are at Kirkpatrick Price, we are a PCI QSA and licensed CPA firm providing assurance services to clients worldwide. The firm has over 10 years of experience in information assurance by performing assessments, audits, and tests that strengthen information security and compliance controls. I would also like to encourage everyone to subscribe to our blog. We're constantly posting regular industry updates and tips and best practices, so it's a great way to stay in the know. Also, feel free to check out our library of pre-recorded webinars, also located on our website, and connect with us on LinkedIn. Our moderator today will be Jesse Skibby. Jesse has over 15 years of experience in information security. As Vice President of Strategic Development and the Chief Compliance Officer for Kirkpatrick Price, she is focused on assisting clients in meeting regulatory compliance and information security objectives. And as you can see, Jesse has a whole slew of certifications. And she, so Jesse?
Thank you, Sarah. You're absolutely right. I do have a lot of certifications, some of them security related, some of them regulatory compliance related. So most of you that know me on the compliance side of the house. So I'm very happy to be here moderating this webinar, and I'm very happy to have Jeff Wilder join me. So I want to go ahead and talk a little bit more about the services that Kirkpatrick Price offers. If you want to go to the next slide, Sarah. So basically, like I mentioned, we do work in both spaces, information security primarily, as well as regulatory compliance. We can help companies with policy and procedure, risk assessment guidance, vendor compliance management, and of course, the CAPB mock audits that we do. But we're here today to talk about PCI and to talk about information security. And as Sarah mentioned, we are a PCI QSA firm as well as a CPA firm. So that allows us to do a variety of audits, including those that you see on the screen there. Using our online audit manager, we're able to accomplish, multiple audit objectives with one easy process. So definitely follow up with us after the webinar if you want more information on any of the other services that we perform. So you can go to the next slide. As I mentioned, we're here to talk about PCI. So what is PCI DSS? The Payment Card Industry Data Security Standard was jointly developed by the payment card brands to encourage the enhanced cardholder data security and facilitate the broad adoption of consistent data security measures globally. You're here today to talk about Requirement 7, so you must know a thing or two about the DSS. So we're going to go ahead and jump right in. Let's go to the next slide. Again, I guess just an overview for you. Who does it apply to? It applies to any merchant who stores, processes, or transmits cardholder data, any service provider who stores, processes, or transmits cardholder data on behalf of a merchant, or any sub-service provider of a merchant or service provider who has active access to their cardholder data environment. You can go to the next slide. An overview of the DSS itself, there's approximately 212 controls, 6 control objectives, and 12 subject areas. The next slide does a good job of giving you that high-level overview. And we have done some webinars taking it step by step, going through requirements 1 and 2, 3 and 4, 5 and 6, and now we're on 7. So I definitely encourage you to, if you want more information and you like our kind of ask the assessor style of doing these webinars, definitely go to our website and check out those pre-recorded webinars covering the previous topics if you happen to miss those. But our goal is to really take you step by step, teaching you each requirement, giving you the auditor, the assessor's perspective on how those individual areas are looked at and giving you that individual guidance. So I really want to jump right in by introducing Jeff Wilder. If you want to go to the next slide, we're so happy to have Jeff join our firm. Jeff has over 15 years of experience in information security. Prior to joining Kirkpatrick Price, just about, not quite 2 months ago, Jeff was a trainer for the PCI Security Standards Council, where he was responsible for education for the individuals working towards becoming a qualified security assessor. In his role of Director of PCI Services at Kirkpatrick Price, Jeff is responsible for all aspects of PCI services, really the cradle-to-grave delivery aspect of PCI. So, and Jeff has obviously his own certification list here, highly qualified security individual. So I want to say welcome, Jeff. We are so pleased to have you join our team. I know you've been here for less than 2 months. So how has your experience been so far?
You know, I honestly, you know, not just because, you know, I'm standing here with a whole bunch of people. I don't think I've ever been happier at any other, you know, job ever. This has been, even the 2 months that I've been here, has just been absolutely a great time. I'm really enjoying what I do. It's nice to be able to be, you know, in the company of good quality, caring people that really are, you know, really concerned about doing a great job. This has been a lot of fun. So I'm really enjoying it. You know, I've really taken the bull by the horns. You know, like in most organizations, when you start at a new company, you get a couple of weeks of you know, kind of this honeymoon period where you're gradually brought into things and learning how things work. No, that's not what happened. I'm full in. So I've taken it full on. So this has been good.
So the thing I like about your background too, Jeff, is that you've been an educator, you know, for several years, and now it's not going to end. I mean, our goal at Kirkpatrick Price is to definitely educate and inspire our clients and those people that are working towards achieving these compliance goals. So we definitely look forward to everything to come for you as far as representing our company and educating the community. So Let's go to the next slide, because I want to talk about something. I want to hand it over to you here, but one of your next webinar, I think it's coming up next week or within the next 2 weeks.
24th, I think it is.
Okay. And that we're going to talk about scope, because one of the things that you brought to us right away was we need to do more education on how important scope is to a PCI project. So I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to you and have you kind of talk through why this is important.
Absolutely. So it's not really just my philosophy, but it really is true that one of the most important things that you can do as an organization, before I get into that, I want to kind of talk a little bit about my philosophy, Jesse. You know, it's really my belief that organizations really need to focus on being secure, right? And if you're truly secure, compliance is going to drop out the bottom. And you know, for those of you on the call that have ever interacted with me in the past, I know that there's several out there I've had conversations with already, would know that to be true. And really, it's kind of the concept and the idea that if you don't know what you have, right, if you don't know where your assets are, if you don't know where your information is, you know, how can you expect to protect it? And really, the compliance framework is just a measurement of how secure you're handling that particular asset. So from an organizational perspective, when we look at PCI, in the preamble to the PCI DSS, one of the things that it says is that you as an organization are obligated to and responsible for, at least annually and prior to the assessment, defining the scope of your environment, right? And you look at requirement, you know, 112 and 113, it talks about maintaining network diagrams and making sure that they're updated and current and data flow diagrams. And really, it's the most important thing that we can do is part of maintaining the quality and management of our security program is drawing the circle around those assets that need to be protected. So, you know, really, when we look at it from a return on investment as well, is that if there's an asset that we need to protect, we truly need to apply all the necessary controls. But subsequent to that is that, there's not a justifiable return on investment if the asset doesn't warrant, the controls and the energy and the effort and the resources that you're going to apply to it. Let's find out what those are. So we focus our energies and our efforts and our resources in the right places, right? So one of the things that you're going to need to do as part of your annual assessment, and this particular conversation will probably take place at the beginning of every of these webinars, is talk a little bit about scope, but is to maintain and identify the scope of your environment, right? And then what happens is the assessor will come in and say, okay, tell me what have you defined as the scope of your environment? And then from that, the assessor is going to, select the scope of their assessment. So, where you're looking for your QSA to define the scope of your environment, that's really your obligation. Now, I'm sure that most QSAs, in the industry are more than happy to help you do that, but realistically, that's your obligation, okay? So let's go ahead and move forward. All right, so there's some very specific things as the DSS calls out about what do we determine as being in scope, and everybody should know by now we have the three-legged stool, right? If the asset stores, processes, and transmits it, it's in scope. But when we look at that preamble that I'm talking about, there's also a couple of other things, and to paraphrase them, really it's those systems that are also connected to, right, the systems that store, process, and transmit, and understand that there's a difference between being in scope and being the CDE, right? So we can have systems that are considered in scope but are not CDE, right? And we'll talk about that a little bit more in the next webinar. So really, it's the systems that store, process, and transmit, and any system that is connected to the CDE, right? So as to give an example, if I have a device with a layer 3 connectivity into my database, that device, right, can prospectively impact the security of the cardholder data, and therefore we need to address that particular address that particular risk. So then next we have the systems that are providing security services, our Active Directory servers, our patching servers, our NTP servers, things of that nature, our logging servers. And then really it's any system that can, impact the security of. And that's really kind of the catch-all. But effectively when we establish what should be considered in scope, if by people, process, and technology, while the PCI DSS is very specific to technology, it's not a technology standard, right? When you look at the controls, it covers people, processes, and technologies. So when we establish the scope, we have to understand what are the business processes. And if somehow a business process can implement a risk into the cardholder data environment, then that process needs to be considered in scope as well. Now, in order to say something is out of scope, right, the other side of that, what it takes to determine if something is not in scope, we have to determine that there's no ability for that asset at all to impact the security of cardholder data. And from a networking perspective, at a minimum, we look at establishing basically an air gap, that there's no way that this particular asset has any ability to communicate to the in-scope environment, and that would bring that asset out of systems. So if we can go ahead and go to the next slide, really what we're talking about in requirement 7 is those processes, right? Because it establishes people, processes, and technology. And when we get to requirement 7 is really about restricting access to the cardholder data environment to those that need it. Now, if your organization has everybody in your environment that absolutely needs access to cardholder data, then so be it. There's nothing wrong with it, right? But there we look to make sure that if a specific person does not have a business need to have data, that we restrict that to the least privileges, okay? So let's go ahead and move on. So to give you a little bit of background, I've already talked about this a little bit, but requirement 7 is really about establishing this program of least privileges. And when you look at it from a holistic perspective, we kind of have this concept of role-based access controls. So in order to establish role-based access controls, we then have to identify, who are the owners of the data, right? So that we can go to those individuals and get approval for the data. We can then, apply that particular, set of controls that need to be applied to that data. Then we have the custodian. So the data owner and the data custodian can be the same individual, but in many cases they're different, and we'll talk a little bit about that in a minute. as part of requirement 7, it really is the core, it's the basis, if you would, of what needs to be established when we look to apply requirement 8, which is something that we're going to be covering after our scoping exercise, the scoping call that we'll be having here in a couple of weeks. But requirement number 8 is authentication, where requirement 7 is authorization. We're looking to get authorization for access to this. Now, of the DSS controls, we only have 3 controls, and really one of them is about maintaining policies and procedures. Okay, so we're gonna cover those in detail here in a few minutes. So as part of this, of these webinars, right, it's not just our goal to stand up here and read the slides off, you know, from what it says, right? You can sit in your office or you can be, you know, somewhere reading those. But what we're looking to do is add a little bit of value to you, to this process for you, right? So when we look at requirement 7, it really requires that we develop some type of program management, right, around the authorization and authentication of who can get access to this. So as I've talked about already, requirement number 7 is focused on developing roles, right? So we have to look to define those. And here on the screen we have a couple of examples. You know, who are your call center agents or agencies, right? Because remember, it's just not individuals. If we have third parties, if we have service providers that have access into your, into your organization, we have to consider those as part of this requirement as well. What about your networking administration, your accounting to people? What, if you're in a merchant environment or in a, in a food services, you might have the front of house and the back of house staff. So it's going through your entire organization and mapping out who these roles are. Now, once these roles have been established, we need to define what access do they actually need, and that then becomes the basis for requirement 8 that we'll talk about later. All right, let's go ahead and move on. All right, so every one of the controls within the PCI DSS that you ever encounter is going to require policies and procedures. I want to have a little bit of conversation, and please forgive me if this seems patronizing, but as assessors, we often encounter organizations that really truly don't understand the difference between what a policy and what a procedure is. As a given example, a policy is typically an executive level document. Usually the board of directors owns the policies. We might have mid-level management is the custodian of them, but the policies are an executive level document that says thou shalt do something, or this is the way that we want our business run. And a set of procedures defines what is it that we have to do in order to meet that policy. Okay, so we need to develop these policies around restricting access based on least privileges, okay? And we need to maintain a formal approval process for these policies and procedures as well, okay? So let's go ahead and move forward. Now, as part of developing, we've defined the roles, the policies, the procedures. Now we have to make sure that our systems that we bring on board, right, and that we're developing, if you have a development shop, one of the requirements in 6.3 says that you need to have an SDLC that incorporates, PCI throughout the entire SDLC. And this is a perfect example of where this would come into play, is that if your organization is going to be developing software, you need to make sure that it can apply those restrictions that we've talked about when we've developed our roles as part of the policies and procedures, right? But so we need to make sure that we have these systems that are capable of supporting the role-based access control, and we're really going to look for a default deny, and we'll talk about that in a moment as well. All right, so if we can go ahead and move forward. All right, so we talked about procedures. We need to make sure that our policies are fully documented. And with the advent of when 3.2, or sorry, 3.1, 3.0 came about, they added this next little bullet point that I absolutely love, and it says that make sure that the policies are actually in use. So the reason why we're kind of going through this program management perspective is because when you engage with a QSA to assess your environment, these are the things that they're going to be asking for. These are the things that they're going to be looking at. So whatever it is that you're doing, you need to document that, because what's going to occur is your assessor is going to get a hold of that documentation, and they're going to read it, and then they're going to assess your organization based on what it is that you've said you're doing. If you have a policy that says XYZ, you really need to be doing XYZ, because what happens is that at the end of each one of these, the requirements, there's this, what I call a capstone that says everything needs to be documented in use and effectively communicated to all relevant individuals. So what we look for as part of that is that you're actually doing what it is that you say that you're doing. Okay, so in many cases where the policies and procedures don't exist, it's easy enough to just work with your staff and find out what is it that we're doing and put that on paper, and you're probably going to be okay. So your assessor is going to be asking for policies, procedures. They're going to be asking for a list of the roles within the organization, right? And specifically where, Johnny, Betty, Susie, Tommy, Larry, whether an admin or whoever they are, if they have access to that data based on the role that they're in, why they have it, and specifically as part of that, those individuals they're going to ask for a list of those individuals with privileged access. Now, when we look at privileged access, right, it's not just the people that are administrators. It might also be those individuals that have the access to, to view full cardholder data, or to perhaps change or impact somebody else's experience as it relates to cardholder data, right? So your assessor is going to be asking for this documentation when you engage with your assessor. All right, so let's go on. All right. So we're going to need a list of those individuals that are responsible for assigning access. Now, earlier in the presentation, we talked a little bit about the difference between the data owner and the data custodian, right? So the data owner is usually the business organization. It's the business part of the organization that actually owns the data. They're the ones that are going to define who actually needs access to the cardholder data, right? So when we specifically look for, one of the requirements that says an individual, interview the list of individuals that are responsible for assigning access, this is not just necessarily the help desk people, right? This is the people that are saying these individuals have approval for the access, right? So that, and then as part of that, to identify, who has it, we need a list of the management individuals with the privileged access, because what has to happen is we'll talk to the database administrators and we'll find out, yeah, you have access to cardholder data. We go to their manager and say, why does this individual need cardholder data? If we removed access to cardholder data from this particular individual's task or their roles, would that break what they do? And if the answer is yes, then it's probably appropriate that they have it. But, you have to evaluate that on an individual role basis. If you remove the access to cardholder data, would it break that individual's business process? And if the answer is no, then we need to look to remove that. Okay, so let's go ahead and move forward. So that covers interviews. Now, as part of this, one of the requirements says that you need to make sure that your systems are capable of enforcing that. So when you're looking to develop an RFP, or when you're going out and looking for new solutions to meet some, technical constraint or a new widget machine, you need to make sure that you perform an appropriate holistic review, making sure that these particular assets can either integrate with your current Active Directory, or that natively by themselves they're able and capable of enforcing all of the necessary privileges that you've defined in your policies and procedures. A really good example of this is, if you look at as a given example, a simple DSL router that you have in your house, right? There's really no way to enforce any of the privileges. While you can log on to it, that doesn't have the capabilities to fully meet all of the PCI DSS requirements. And this access control system needs to be established and capable on when you buy a commercial application, and we also need to look at it for the homegrown applications. So make sure if your organization is developing your own homegrown applications and not just purchasing the commercial off-the-shelf stuff that you're developing, the bespoke, that you ensure that your capabilities from your development perspective and your SDLC cover the need for making sure that you can apply the roles as necessary for your organization. Okay. So let's go ahead and move on. All right. So let's start getting into the actual requirements. Requirement 7.1 really talks about limiting access to those individuals that have the need to access cardholder data. Now, if the individual has a business need for it, there's absolutely nothing wrong with giving them all of the access that they need, right? The PCI DSS is not really there, nor is it intended to break your business. The role and the intent behind PCI DSS, and specifically this 7.1, is to ensure that you have a governance and oversight around who has access into the cardholder data environment, right? So the assessor is going to look at the system components, the data resources, and specifically the level of privileges that are going to be required for assessing that. So Jesse, I see that we had a couple of questions pop up already. If you wanted to pick up a few of them there.
Sure, I would love to. I wanted to, I guess, remind everybody too that how you get to the QA box is actually through options on the menu, options and QA. We did have a question come in that was relevant to 7.1. I wasn't sure if we were ready for that question yet, or if you wanted to wait till you were through this one.
Okay, let's go ahead and move on, and then we can probably readdress more. I just want to make sure we don't lose sight of those questions for.
Okay. Yep.
All right. So 7.1.1. So we've already talked about defining the access needs for each of the individual role. So as part of your organization, you have a little bit of back-end work that you need to do to define, what are the roles that we have in our organization. Now, this could be one role, it could be 100 roles. It could be whatever it is that you need in order for your business and your organization to function. Typically, if we have a retail environment, right, we look to identify, cashiers. Then when we look at we look at the food services, we might look at management staff that might have different access to cardholder data. Where we have technical staff, we'll talk about the help desk staff or the call center staff. Those are the types of roles that we're looking for when we look to address specifically this 7.1.1, which is defining the access for each individual person, okay? So we're going to look to define what are those roles, then we're going to basically look at those roles and making sure that from an assessment perspective, they realistically map to what your organization is doing, okay? So let's go ahead and move forward.
I do have a question here,
yep.
actually, Jeff.
Yep.
This one in regards to the job classifications and roles. Does a company need to have job descriptions for all of their employees, or how do they define those roles?
That's a really good question. So this is a multifaceted conversation, and I'll get back to you with that. I'll get back to answer. So I have to give you a little bit of background. When we look at the PCI DSS, right, the PCI DSS does not define for an organization how to run their business. As part of that, it's not up to the assessor. It's not within the assessor's obligation, purview, roles, or responsibilities to define how an organization is to run their business, okay? What it is that we're looking for and what the PCI DSS says is that you have to define those, right? So if an organization just wanted to specifically define those based on an individual role, like, this is the network administrator and these are the privileges that the network administrator gets. These are the help desk people, these are the roles that they get. If they want to define it based on, the job description, right, they're welcome to do that. So it's not defined what that looks like. And remember, Jesse, that these particular topics, right, when we ask for, that we've defined those roles, right, and we've identified what those roles are, organizations should not be creating this documentation as what I call audit fodder, right? They should not be developing this just to meet the PCI DSS requirement that says we have to have it. Really, the intent behind this is that we as an organization have developed this documentation so that we know when somebody is in a role, what privileges that they get. It should be something that they use. It should be something that's relevant to their organization. So to answer your question, right, the answer is both yes, right? It can be just the actual name, or it can be a full job description. It's whatever that specific company needs in order to ensure that they have control over assigning access to an individual that performs certain tasks, okay? All right, so did we have any other questions on this one, Jesse, or was that it?
We do another question, but I think I'm going to wait until the next slide there.
Okay, let's go ahead and move on. All right, so when we look at developing these restrictions, we've identified the roles, then we need to look to apply those restrictions and those privileges necessary for that particular individual based on least privileges. Now, once again, least privileges is really kind of a nebulous thing. It's, you know, I kind of described it, you know, when I'm giving this training, it's like asking how long is a piece of string, and well, how long do you want, right? We have to look at what is it that this individual needs in order to perform their job. And as I've said several times already, as long as they have the business need to have that access, it's absolutely appropriate. But as a given example, where we have a database administrator that then also has, you know, the domain access passwords, you know, or domain access control, administrative control over an Active Directory, you know, that's where the assessor is going to look and see, well, okay, I see that we have a DBA here, and he's also a member of the, you know, domain administrators group. I need an explanation for that. If we take away that specific privilege from that individual, will they still be able to perform their job? So when we define that least privileges, it's really based on everything that they need. That's fine, they can get it, but if it's not necessary, then we look to pull that back. So we establish all of these specific roles. And then what we need to do is ask the question, well, what privileges does this individual need? Now, mind you, it's not just the individuals that have access to cardholder data, right? It's not just the people that sit in the call center. It might also be those individuals that have the ability to impact the security of the cardholder data environment. As a given example, your network administrator, they may not have access to the decryption keys, but I can guarantee you that if they misconfigure the environment, you know, that they could pose a risk. So we look to limit those, you know, the exposure to the environment and the exposure and minimizing that footprint of attack by removing those accesses that really aren't required. So where we have the documented list of roles, we've gone through the process of defining, okay, for this role, what is the privilege that they need? And then we have to, you know, we have to have a formal process then where we're assigning the privileges for this particular individual. We have to have some type of formal approval process. So Jesse is a point of conversation. If you own a business process, and you know, my staff are coming to me and saying, hey, I need access to that, I should not be the one that's approving that. Where you are the business owner, right? You would be the one that's approving the access to that, you know, to that particular asset. So this is where the 7.14 really applies the concept of not of least privileges, of the data owner and the data custodian, where I might be the custodian, I'm the one that's working with the data, I'm the one that's responsible for the management of it. As the owner, it's your obligation and responsibility to apply those and to define who can have access and who cannot, okay?
So we have a question regarding this one, Jeff, that came in. They're asking what forms of documented approval are acceptable? Would an email to the help desk be sufficient?
You know, that once again, I think that's whoever sent that in, that's a great question, right? So when we look at that, once again, it's not up to the PCI Security Council to define how you run your business. It's not up to the assessor to define how you run your business. Effectively, what we need here, right, is some approval process that says this is the data owner, right, and this data owner approved this individual or this group of people or this role to have this type of access to the data that the custodian or that the data owner actually owns. So a lot of times, you know, part of an assessment, an organization might use some type of ticketing system like Remedy, or, you know, there's a plethora of ticketing systems where that is tracked. I've interviewed organizations that they used, you know, pen and paper, right? They keep a documented list on physical paper. They can use email. You know, for all that matters, they could use a chalkboard, you know, for maintaining this. What's important is that there's some type of acknowledgement from the owner of that data that these particular individuals, groups, people, role, whoever, have been approved access, right? So we have to have some type of documented approval, whether it be an email. Email is perfectly fine, or a documented ticketing system. You know, we don't define how you get there as long as you've met that obligation. Okay?
Well, and it should obviously match up with what's documented within the policy and procedure, right? This is what the management has said is acceptable as far as a format for documenting approval.
Right. So that's a good point, right? So we have typically what we look for, right, when we're assessing this, is that we have a policy, and typically the policy is going to say all individuals with access to sensitive authentication must be approved, right? That is a policy statement. Then we look at the procedure statement that says, you know, go get the chalkboard, or go get the pen and paper, or go to this website, or go to this ticketing, you know, system, or call whoever. That actually then defines it. So there are two different distinctive things that we look for that marry up with this. But that's exactly what we talked about a few minutes ago, right? Is that one of the requirement 7, the last requirement in 7 is, you know, make sure everything's documented and then in use, right? So the assessor will be validating that whatever it is that you're doing is documented, as that is what you are actually doing. Okay. All right. So let's so we make sure we stay on track here. Let's go ahead and move forward. All right. So we get to requirement 7.2, where 7.1 was really focused on the paperwork, the approval, the management, right, the governance and oversight of the authorization process. Requirement 7.2 really says that all systems that are in scope, right, need to have some type of access control system that is based on a default deny all. Right, and it needs to be for everything. If we have an FTP or an SFTP server, if we have a homegrown application, it doesn't matter, right? When we look at 7.2.1 specifically, it says coverage for all systems. Now, where organizations typically start to run into trouble with this is when they start dealing with legacy applications. You know, we have this old embedded application that scans, bills or way bills from, people shipping stuff. And they've been using this application for 10 years. And before PCI come about and before, all of these requirements were in place, we find that these types of applications, your legacy applications, don't have the ability to either provide their own authentication schema that can impose this role-based access control, or it doesn't have the ability to, connect into your Active Directory. So we need to make sure that we have a system that supports the access, the accesses that we're needing, right? And that it has a default deny all. So when we look at the default deny all, really what we're talking about is that we provide access by exception, right? So a brand new user, somebody that does not have permission to access this asset, does not indeed have that ability to do so. So we look for providing access based on an exception to the process rather than, shutting off access by exception, okay? All right, so before we move on, did we have any other questions in the queue, or how are we doing there?
We did have a question come in. The question was, if I'm using Active Directory, Microsoft Active Directory, does that qualify as an access control system?
So it does, right? But understand, for the person that submitted this question, where we're using something like Active Directory, just because we have Active Directory in-house does not cover us holistically. You might have a Linux Unix system that doesn't connect to it, right, by default, typically they have an access control system, but I'm just using things as an example. So just the fact that you have Active Directory does not in itself mean that it's implemented and appropriately managed, right? Because all of these things we effectively, whether they're two individual access control systems, whether I have a Linux Unix system or we're using AAA connected to our Active Directory, all of these things, all the process that we're talking about need to work in sync. Now, when we look at are they working in sync, that doesn't mean that they're all working together. It's that they're managed, all managed the same way. That when somebody quits the organization, and we'll get into this when we cover requirement 8. But from the access control system, when somebody quits, your organization, that we make sure that all of the passwords or all of the accounts are removed holistically. So the default denial, and when we look at the access control system, Active Directory absolutely is an access control system, but typically it's only for the Microsoft environment and for the systems that are bound to or that connect into the LDAP process. Okay, so let's go ahead and move forward. We get that to index. There we go. Okay. So 7.3 is really kind of the capstone, and we come to the end of this conversation about what requirement 7 is about. Requirement 7.3 just requires that we as an organization, we have control over our assets and that we have an understanding there's the management, oversight, and governance. And in order to do that, we need to ensure that the management staff has developed and approved policies, that those policies are clearly communicated, that you have procedures that define how you go about doing things within your organization, and that anybody and everybody within the organization that's subject to those policies and procedures, whether they be a third-party organization, whether they be an extension of your staff, or whether they actually be employees, have been trained on how to effectively utilize those security postures that we're trying to establish. Okay, so if we can go ahead and move on. All right. So as a conclusion for requirement 7, you need to maintain the good policies and procedures. And these policies and procedures, they don't need to be PhD thesis statements and all lawyered up and all HR'd up, right? The purpose and the reason why, we talk about maintaining a good policy. What a good policy is that if I give this particular policy to little Grandma Betty who's, running the till for us, and she's subject to a policy that little Grandma Betty can understand what's at stake and what she needs to do. So we look at the policies and procedures from that perspective. Are they usable? A lot of organizations, we interact with and that I've interacted with, they're really proud of this big tome of information that's 300 pages. There isn't anybody in the organization that's ever read them. So make sure that you keep a good set of policies and procedures that are actually usable, right? We need to maintain a list of the asset owners, right? Because we need to identify who can approve access to these things, right? We want to minimize our footprint of attack. And it's not just about where, Johnny or Betty, the network administrators, about not trusting them. You have to consider that if Betty or Johnny's access, right, or their accounts have been compromised, we don't want to allow that person that compromised those particular assets to get any more access to the environment than what they would normally have, right? So we're going to look to remove any unnecessary access. Make sure that your systems support that default deny all, right, so that it just can't connect to it and it's open by default, okay? And lastly, and the most important thing that you can do is make sure that you educate your staff. This isn't just about requirement 7, right? This is really about the holistic program that you need to implement. But really what we need to do is we need to educate all members of your staff on the policies and the procedures and how to appropriately implement them. And it's not just a matter of, once a year, and we talk about in the DSS that they're ongoing training, right, is we need to make sure that we work with them in order to make sure that they understand that they're actually implementing them and train to educate and train those staff where there might be processes. So you're going to need to be doing your own internal assessments throughout the year, right? Making sure that the policies and the procedures that you've implemented are actually what it is that you're doing, okay? So let's go ahead and move on. So I want to go ahead and turn this back over to Jesse. My name is Jeff Wilder, and if anybody should have any questions about any of the things that we've presented today, please feel free to reach out to to Kirkpatrick Price. We're more than happy to spend whatever time necessary with you to to help you through understanding. While we're here for a living, really my goal here is to help the industry. I love this industry. I love what I'm doing. I love to share. Those of you that have ever interacted with me can corroborate that. I'm really here to help you to become successful, right? So please, don't hesitate to reach out to Kirkpatrick Price if you should need some assistance with, just understanding these concepts and how they might, apply to your organization. Okay. So Jesse.
I definitely encourage
so
can you okay?
So, yeah, this, for those of you that might be able to hear me, I just got somebody ping me that said that the conference call pretty much died.
I can hear you now, Jeff. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah, I can hear you now. So there you are.
Okay.
So
sorry, did you hear the question?
Well, it basically, I didn't hear anything past the turning it back over to you, so I apologize.
Oh, okay. Okay, well, we did have a question, so as long as we have a couple minutes, hopefully people can hear us. So the question was, I thought I heard Jeff mention providing the assessor with a list of roles. Is that required or just best practice, and is that reflected in the ROC, was the question.
Right, so it is required that you do maintain a list of those roles, because what the assessor is going to do is the assessor is going to get a list of those roles in Requirement 7. They're going to compare those roles against the privileges on paperwork that said these roles are authorized to have access to. They're then going to take that particular set of documentation into Requirement 7 and then look and see what's actually been applied. So those roles are absolutely necessary. It is necessary that they're documented in some capacity, what that looks like, whether it be, in a policy, a procedure, some type of ticketing tool, doesn't really matter, but it is absolutely necessary that those roles be documented. Okay.
All right, well, that's all the questions we have. Unfortunately, we lost about 10 of our attendees there, I think, during the breakup. So I know that's too bad. It's unfortunate, but I think that's it. So I guess coming up next, as we're showing in the screen here, we talked earlier about scoping being such a critical part of the process, and we have that coming up March 24th at 12 p.m. Central Time. And we have a link there for those of you that want to go and register. And Sarah, if you want to tell everybody, they will get copies, I believe, of this presentation after the webinar. Sarah?
We'll make sure to get it out.
Yes.
One of the things, sorry for the technical issues we're having here. One of the things that I would like to add, just as for those of you that have certifications, remember to log this as a CPE, right? So you get, you know, an hour worth of CPEs for this, just as from us to you.
That's a great point.
Yeah, yeah. So it's a good way to, you know, to keep up your CPEs, and please feel free to share this these webinar series with anybody that that you would think would have interest, you know, in any of these topics. So that's all that I had.
Well, thank you so much, Jeff, for joining in. It does look like Sarah got cut out due to the technical difficulty, so we're sorry about that. But we look forward to the next webinar coming up on March 24th, and thank you to everybody who joined, and thank you so much, Jeff, for providing us with such great content.
You're welcome. Have a good day, everybody.
Thank you. Bye-bye.